Hello, today we're talking about rounding, and in particular rounding to the nearest 10, the nearest 100 and the nearest 1,000. Before we start that, we're going to do a very, very quick recap on place value. It's important that you understand place value before you can do rounding. If you want a full explanation about place value, click on the link up here and it will take you to a video explaining place value in full. The next thing we're going to look at is the excuse me, what the rules are for rounding. That didn't work. There we go, rules for rounding. We're then going to apply the rules of rounding and we're going to just explore them a little bit further. So let's begin. You need to understand place value in order to be able to round numbers. You can see I've written here units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s. Obviously it goes beyond that, but for our purposes, this is all we need today. We are going to focus on these three: tens, hundreds and thousands. Let's start by looking at the rules of rounding. So there's one major rule for rounding, and that is anything that's 5 or more rounds up, anything that's 4 or less rounds down. If you remember that one rule and you apply that one rule to all of your rounding, it will make perfect sense. Let's look at some examples of rounding. So let's take a number and we're going to round that number to the nearest 10. We'll extend that same principle to round to the nearest 100 and then the nearest 1,000. This rule applies to all rounding, just remember that. Okay, let's look at some rounding now. We're going to look at rounding to the nearest 10 first. Let's say we're going to round 13 to the nearest 10. The first step is to look to see where we're rounding to. So we are rounding to the nearest 10 and we've got two digits there, 1 and 3. We need to stop our numbers at that point there, at the tens, in the tens column. So you look at the digit to the right of that. In this case it's the 3. The 3 is less than 4 because remember the rule that 4 or less rounds down. 3 is less than 5, so it rounds down to a 0 and the 1 remains where it is. Therefore 13 rounds down to 10. If we have a number that is 5 or more in the units column, in this case because we're rounding to tens, if we have a number that's 5 or more, let's say we have 16, that 6 will round up, meaning that the 6 will become a 0. But what we'll have to do is we'll have to add 1 to our tens column. So 1 plus 1 will give you 2 and the 6 has become a 0. So 16 rounds up to 20. That same rule applies all the way through. If you've got a slightly bigger number, let's say you've got 343 and you need to round that to the nearest 10, your rule's still the same. You still go to your tens column there and you only look at whether you round up or down to the column on the right of that, in this case the 3 again. The 3 we know will round down, so this will become a 0. The 4 will remain as it is because we're not adding to it. Your rounding will be 340. Notice that the 3 in the hundreds column has stayed exactly as it was. So any numbers to the left of where you're rounding remain exactly as they are. If we take a number that is even bigger than that, let's say we say 6, 4, 7, 9, and we need to round that to the nearest 10, the same principle applies. The 9 is in the units column, the 7 is in the tens column. We need to stop here at 7. So we look at whether we're rounding the 9 up or down. 9 will round up, we know that. So that will become a 0, and you add 1 to your tens column. Notice that the 6 and the 4 stay exactly as they are, therefore your new number will be, your rounded to the nearest 10 will be 6,480. The same principle applies when you are rounding bigger numbers. So let's look at rounding to the nearest 100 next. Let's say we have 249. This time we're rounding to the nearest 100. We go to the next column along, which is the 4. We look to see whether we round the 4 up or down. We need to round the 4 down because it's less than 5. That becomes a 0. Any digits after that will automatically become a 0. Therefore, 249 becomes 200. If that number was slightly higher, let's say we say 473, and we're rounding to the nearest 100. The same principle applies. You go to your hundreds column, in this case the 4. You go to the next column on the right, which is the 7 here. We need to decide whether we're rounding 7 up or down. We know that we need to round 7 up, and any numbers after that, any digits after that, turn into a 0. So this 3 will become a 0. The 7 will become a 0, but because we're rounding up, we'll add 1 to our hundreds column. 4 add 1 gives you 5, and then you've got the 200. So rounding 473 to the nearest 100 will give you 500. Let's look at the thousands, rounding to the nearest 1,000. Again, the same principle applies. This time, we've got one more column, thousands. So let's pick a number, 2,560. We're rounding to the nearest 1,000, so we stop at the thousands column. We look at the digits after the thousands column. The next one on the right is a 5. This is the one that we need to determine whether we're rounding up or down. Remember that anything after that, we are changing down to zeros. The 5 rounds up because the rule is 5 or more you round up. This rounds up, therefore that becomes 0, and we add 1 to our thousands column. So 2,560 will become 3,000. Let's try a different number. Let's say we have 4,258. The same principle applies. You go to your thousands column. Remember, we're rounding to the nearest 1,000. We go to the thousands column. We go to the next column along, in this case the 2 in the hundreds column. Anything after that becomes a 0. The 58 becomes 0, 0. The 2 we know we need to round down, and because we're rounding down, we don't add anything to the 4. The 4,258 becomes 4,000. Let's extend this concept a little bit further. We are going to take a number and see what we can do with that. So we've got 3, 5, 2, 8. We're going to round this number to the nearest 10 first and foremost. So to round it to the nearest 10, we go to the tens column. We look at what we're doing with the 8. We need to round the 8 up. And so the 8 becomes a 0. We add a 1 there. The new number becomes 3530. Let's take that number again. And this time we're going to round to the nearest 100. We go to the hundreds column. We go to the hundreds column, then look at the number on to the right of that. We've got 2. 2 we know needs to round down, so that becomes a 0. Any digits after that automatically become a 0. We don't need to add anything to the hundreds column. So when we round 3528 to the nearest 100, we get 3,500. Let's take that same number, and this time we're going to round it to the nearest 1,000. So 3,528. We need to round it to the nearest 1,000. We go to the column to the right of the thousands column. We know that 5 needs to round up, so the 5 becomes a 0, and we add 1 to our thousands column. Any digits after that become zeros. 1 plus 3 gives you 4, and 3 zeros. So 3,528 rounded to the nearest 1,000 becomes 4,000. There are some numbers that can be quite confusing when we're rounding. For example, if a number ends in a 9 and you need to round that, because there's a knock-on effect, people find that confusing. So let's take this number, 1,999. If you had to round 1,999 to the nearest 100, what do? Well, you still follow the same principles. You go to your hundreds column. You look at the next column along, the 9 in the tens column there, the 90. Does that round up or down? Well, we know that rounds up. We're going to turn that into a 0, and we're going to put a 1 there in our hundreds column. We know that the 9 in the units column becomes 100. We've got a bit of a problem here because 9 plus 1 is 10. What do we do with that? Well, you just follow it through as you would in normal addition. 9 plus 1 gives you 10. You carry it over 2,000. And that principle applies regardless of whether you are rounding tens or hundreds or thousands or any number. That principle will stay. So 1,999 becomes 2,000. Thank you for watching. We'll be rounding decimals in the next video. Goodbye.